The notice had been nailed to the assay post sometime in the dark, and by the time Fong Mei-yu saw it, the ink was already gone brown with the morning damp. She could not read the English words, but she did not need to. She could read the men gathered under it, the way their shoulders had squared, the way their hands hung loose and ready near their belts. She could read the pick handles they carried instead of picks. Behind her, along the muddy bar where the Feather River bent cold and green around a spit of gravel, the little cluster of Chinese tents stood exactly as they had stood every dawn for 2 winters, canvas gone gray, cook smoke rising thin and blue. She pressed the small jade fish that hung against her breastbone until its carved fin bit into her palm, and she waited to learn what the paper meant. Cyrus Tarrant read it aloud for those who could not, and though Mei-yu understood only scraps of his speech, she understood his pleasure in it. He was a wide man with a store and 3 claims and a voice built for camp meetings, and he tapped the paper with one blunt finger as though he had written the law of God upon it. Resolved. The word came up again and again out of the mud of his sentences. Resolved that no celestial shall hold, work, or occupy any ground upon this bar. Resolved. When he finished, he folded his arms, and the men around him made a low sound like water going over stones, and old Ah Fook, who had dug gold in these mountains since before the railroad was a rumor, set down his rocker very slowly and looked at Mei-yu with the patient, terrible calm of a man who has been driven off before and knows the shape of it coming. They did not burn the tents that morning. Terrance's men were in no hurry. They walked the length of the bar the way a man walks a fence line he means to claim, kicking over a pan here, spilling a cradle of black sand there, and told the Chinese in slow, loud words, as one speaks to the deaf, that they had until sundown. Mei-yu gathered what she could carry. She rolled her father's spare shirt around the little brass scale and the packets of dried root, and she wrapped the jade fish twice around her wrist so it would not swing, and she did not weep, because weeping was a thing she had spent on the ocean crossing and had none of left. Her father had gone into that ocean sewn in canvas with a stone at his feet 3 weeks out of Hong Kong, and she had learned in the ship's dark hold that the world took what it wanted and asked no leave. A mining law was only the ocean wearing boots. By afternoon, they were on the wagon road above the bar, 7 of them and 1 handcart, walking toward nothing. Old Ah Fook coughed as he walked, the deep, wet cough that had lived in his chest since the first frost, and the boy Ah Loy carried the cookpot on his back like a turtle, and Mei-yu walked at the rear, where she could watch the road behind them. That was how she saw the man on the gray mule before any of the others did. He came up the grade at an unhurried angle, hat pulled low, a beard gone iron and rust at the jaw, and a face weathered to the color and grain of old harness leather. She did not know him. She knew only that a lone white man riding toward a band of exiled Chinese on an empty road was, in her experience, never good news, and her hand went again to the jade at her wrist. The man drew rein a few paces off, looked the whole sorry procession over, and settled his gaze on her at the back as though he had known she would be the one to meet his eye. "You Fook's people," the man said. It was not a question. When none of them answered, he shifted his weight in the saddle and spat to the side, and looked up the road toward the camp with an expression she could not name. "Terrance a thief with a law book," he said, "more to the river than to them. That ground you're leaving is still paying color, and he knows it. And that's the whole of why there's a law now where there wasn't one Tuesday." He reached back and loosed something from behind his saddle, a bundle of jerked venison, she saw, and a sack of flour, and let it down at old Ah Fook's feet without dismounting. "You'll not make the next camp by dark with that cough," he said. Then his eyes came back to Mei-yu and held, 1 beat too long. "I hold a claim on the far bar, past the burnt sycamore. Worked out, they say. Maybe it is. I'm one man, and I'm slow." He paused, as though the next words cost him something. "The law says a celestial can't hold ground. It don't say a thing about who works mine." And with that, he turned the mule and rode back down the grade, leaving them to make of it what they would, and Mei-yu stood in the road with the flour sack against her ankle, and no idea in the world what the man had just done to her fate. His name was Ezra Coyle, and the camp had opinions about him the way a camp has opinions about weather. He had come out in 52 and never gone home. He had struck it twice and lost it twice. He lived alone in a cabin of squared logs above the far bar, with a gray mule and a shelf of books swollen fat with damp, and he spoke to almost no one. Some said he had killed a man in the early days, Some said he had only watched a man be killed and done nothing, and that this was worse, and that it had turned him strange. What Mayu came to know first, in those uncertain days after the 7 of them made their cautious camp at the edge of his worked-out ground, was that he rose before light, that he took his coffee black and bitter enough to strip paint, and that he could not for the life of him keep his own sluice from choking, because he set the riffles too shallow and lost half his fines to the tail race. She watched him lose gold to the river for 3 mornings before she could stand it no longer, and on the 4th she waded out in her father's boots and, without a word, reset his riffle bars a finger's width deeper, and packed the box seams with clay, the way her father had taught her on the ship talk of men who had done it. Ezra Coyle stood on the bank and watched a Chinese woman fix his sluice, and he did not stop her, and he did not thank her. And when she climbed out, he looked at the mud on her hands and said only, "Huh." But the next morning the box ran clean, and the black sand at the head of the riffles glittered, and he did not tell her to leave. That was the beginning of the strange new order of things on the far bar. By day, the Chinese worked Ezra Coyle's claim. His name on the paper at the assay office, unassailable. And the gold they raised was gold from ground no law could take, because in the eyes of that law it was his. He took a share, and it was a fair share, fairer than any of them had dared hope, and the rest they split among themselves and buried in the flour tins against the winter. There was a lie inside the arrangement, and everyone on both sides of it knew the lie, and the lie was this, that a hard old prospector had simply found himself in need of hands. Mayu did not believe it for a moment. She had seen the way he had looked at her on the road. She had seen the way his jaw worked when Terrance's men rode the ridge above them and called down words she was glad she could not translate. Whatever Ezra Coyle was doing, he was not doing it for the color. But she did not ask, because to ask would be to open a door, and she had crossed an ocean, learning to keep doors shut. The camp did not forget them. She had known it would not. Terrance had wanted the Chinese ground for the gold in it, and the gold had simply walked a quarter-mile downriver and gone on paying, and that was an insult a man like Terrance could not carry. It came first as small things, the way real danger always does. A sluice board found sawn half through in the night, so it broke and dumped a morning's wash when the water hit it. Their small garden of cabbage and turnip, the garden Mayu had begged the seeds for, because she had learned on the crossing what the lack of green food did to men's gums and teeth and will, trampled flat under horse tracks that led back toward the camp and stopped, brazen, at Terrance's store. A dead dog left in the head of the tail race to foul the water. Ezra rode into the camp after that one and was gone a long afternoon, and came back with his knuckles split and said nothing about it, and for a week the small things stopped. But Mayu had begun to keep a knife in her sleeve, the little curved paring knife from the cook kit, and at night she lay listening to old Afuk cough in the next tent and to the river, and she understood that the quiet was not peace. It was only the camp deciding how far it was willing to go. It was the sickness that first truly opened the door between them, and it opened it the way a flood opens a levee, all at once and without permission. The wet cough that had lived in old Afuk's chest went down into it that November and took root, and then the boy Aloy took a fever and a flux that hollowed him out in 3 days, and then it went through the little camp like the frost went through the cabbages. Mayu had been a herbalist's granddaughter before she had been a miner's daughter. Her mother's mother had kept a shop of drawers and scales in the village, and Mayu had grown up with the smell of it in her hair. She built a fire and set her pot to boil and went into her father's role for the packets she had carried across the ocean and up the mountains and out of the camp that meant to be rid of her. Bitter dark bark, and a curled red root, and the pale dried flowers whose name in English she never learned. She dosed the boy through a night that she did not think he would live to the end of, holding his head and pouring the bitter tea between his teeth a spoonful at a time, and when the gray light came he was cooler, and by the second dawn he was asking for rice, and old Afuk's cough had loosened enough to let him sleep. She had not slept in 2 days. She was sitting in the tent mouth with the empty pot in her lap when she realized Ezra Coyle was standing at the edge of the firelight, and had been for some time, and was watching her with an expression that had nothing in it of the hard, closed man of the sluice. "My wife had a fever like that," he said. It was the first thing he had ever told her about himself, and she understood, even through her exhaustion, that it had cost him more than a season's gold to say it. On the trail out, her and the girl both. He turned his hat in his hands, around and around. There was a doctor in the train ahead of ours. Wouldn't cross the river to us. Said we weren't worth the wet feet. Irish, dirt poor, nothing to pay him with. His voice did not rise or break. It only went very flat, the way ground goes flat where a heavy thing has stood a long time. I dug 2 graves under a cottonwood by the Platte, and I never learned that doctor's name, and I have wanted, near every day since, to learn it. He looked at the pot in her lap, at her raw red hands. "You'd have crossed the river," he said. It was not a compliment. It was something harder and truer than a compliment, and Mayu found she could not answer it, and the fire popped between them, and neither of them moved to end the quiet, and the river went on in the dark, saying the one long word it always said. Something changed after that night, though neither of them spoke of it, because it was a thing built of what was not said. He began to take his evening coffee at their fire, instead of alone in the cold cabin. She began to leave a bowl of rice and river fish at his door in the mornings, and to mend, without being asked, the elbow of the one good coat he owned. He learned to say a handful of words in her tongue, and mangled every one of them so badly that even old Ah Fook laughed, the first laugh the camp had heard in a month, and Ezra Coyle grinned under his iron beard like a man who had struck a pocket. She, in turn, learned the shape of his silences, which ones meant leave me be, and which ones meant sit with me and say nothing, and she began to be able to tell them apart across the width of a claim, and this frightened her more than Terence men, because it was a knowing that belonged to a life she had not let herself imagine. She was Fong Mei Yu of a village in the Toishan Hills, whose father was in the ocean and whose mother was in the ground, and whose whole inheritance in the world was a jade fish on a red cord. He was a white man who owned a claim on the far bar. The frontier had a word for what they were becoming, and it was not a kind one, and she did not need to know English to know that the word waited for them both. Then, in the last week of that cold December, the far bar gave up its heart. It was Mei Yu who found it, working alone in the low winter water at the head of the claim, where the current dropped its heavy freight against a shelf of blue clay. She had learned to read a river the way her father read one, where it slowed, where it hid its gold, and she had a feeling about the blue clay, and she dug into it with the little pick and turned up a piece of the country the size of a walnut, and it was not black sand, and it was not fool's gold. It was heavy and dull and buttery yellow, and when she scraped it with her thumbnail, the metal took the mark and shone. She sat back on her heels in the cold water, with the thing in her palm, and understood, with a joy that curdled almost at once into fear, that the far bar was not worked out at all. Ezra came at her call and took it from her and bit it, the old miner's habit, and looked at the blue clay shelf, and then looked up the river toward the camp, and Mei Yu watched the joy die in his face exactly as it had died in hers, because they both knew the same thing in the same instant. That gold this bright, on ground the whole camp knew was worked by celestials, was not a fortune. It was a death sentence with the date left blank, and the river ran on cold and green and indifferent between the two of them and the smoke of Cyrus Tarrant's store. They tried to keep it quiet, and they could not, because gold has a smell that men like Tarrant catch on the wind. Ezra took the first poke into the assay office himself and had it weighed and recorded under his own name as the law required, and the assayer's boy talked as boys talk, and within 3 days the whole camp knew that the played-out far bar was throwing coarse gold, and that a Chinese woman had found it, and that a strange old man was letting her keep a share. Mei Yu felt the change in the mountains around her the way an animal feels the change before a storm. The riders on the ridge came more often now, and sat their horses longer, and did not call down words anymore, which was worse than the words. Tarrant himself came, once, walking his big blood bay slowly down the length of the far bar with 2 men behind him, and he did not speak to the Chinese at all. He spoke only to Ezra, low, and Mei Yu could not hear the words, but she could see them land. And she saw Ezra Coyle stand very still with a pick in his 2 hands, not raised, only held, and she saw Terrence smile and turn his horse, and she saw that the smile was the smile of a man who had made up his mind and was only choosing the hour. The hour came on the night of the winter festival, though Tarrant did not know it was a festival, and would not have cared. Mayu had made the little camp keep the turning of the year as best it could so far from home. A few red paper lanterns Aloy had cut and colored with berry juice, a pot of long-life noodles, a scrap of incense burned to the ancestors and to her father in the ocean and her mother in the ground. She had hung the lanterns in the burnt sycamore, and their red light swung and pooled on the black water, and old Ah Fook, whose cough was gone now on her bitter bark, sang in a cracked voice a song from a village none of them would see again. Ezra sat at the edge of the light with his hat off, which she had never seen, and watched the lanterns burn, and when she brought him a bowl of the noodles, he took it and looked at her for a long moment in the red glow, and she thought, with a lurch beneath her ribs, that he was going to say the thing that had stood unsaid between them since the night of the fever. And perhaps he was. She would never know, because that was the moment the first torch came over the rise, and then the second, and then the whole camp seemed to be coming down the ridge in a long, crooked line of fire, and Cyrus Tarrant's voice rolled ahead of them off the water, calling the law, calling resolved, calling for the Celestials to be off his bar and out of his mountains by the morning or answer for it. What happened on the far bar that night, Mayu would carry in her body the rest of her life. Not as pictures, which faded, but as things her muscles remembered without her leave. She remembered shoving old Ah Fook and the boy toward the willow brake and the dark. She remembered the sound a canvas tent makes when a torch takes it, a great soft indrawn breath and then a roar. She remembered Ezra Coyle stepping out into the light of his own burning claim with the long rifle across his body, not aimed, only held, and planting his boots in the mud between the mob and her people, and she remembered the terrible quiet that fell when he did it, 40 armed men, and one, and the fire snapping, and the river, and she remembered his voice, which did not shout, which she had to strain to hear, and which every man on that bar heard anyway. "This is my ground," Ezra Coyle said. "My name's on the paper, and every soul on it is here at my leave." He let that sit. "You want to burn a man out for who he lets dig his own dirt, Cyrus, you go on. But you'll do it in front of 40 witnesses and the marshals a day's ride off, and a hanged prospector's got a way of bringing law up a mountain that a hanged Chinaman never has, and you know it, and that's the only thing you've ever cared about knowing." For a moment, the whole bar hung between one thing and another, the way a stone hangs at the top of its throw, and it might have gone either way, it truly might, except that Cyrus Tarrant was a proud man, and a proud man cannot be looked at, in front of 40 witnesses, the way Ezra Coyle was looking at him, and so he did the thing pride does. He gave a small motion of his hand, and the brute called Rufe, who had been circling wide along the dark water while the talking held every eye, came out of the burnt sycamore's shadow behind Ezra with a pick handle already swinging. Mayu screamed a warning in a tongue Ezra did not know, and it did not matter. There was no time in it. The pick handle took him across the shoulder and the side of the head and drove him down into the mud, and the rifle went spinning away into the dark. And then Roof raised the handle again over the fallen man, and the whole mob leaned forward as one animal, and Mayu did not decide to move. Her body decided. She was across the bar and over Ezra with the little curved paring knife out of her sleeve before her mind had any say in it. One small woman crouched over a downed man in the swinging red lantern light, and she did not scream now. She only held the knife low the way her father had shown her a lifetime and an ocean ago, and she looked up at Roof and at the 40 men behind him, and for one heartbeat, in the fire and the red light, not one of them came on. It was the jade that stopped them, though Mayu would not understand that until much later, when she had the leisure to understand things. As she had flung herself down over Ezra, the cord had broken, and the little jade fish had swung out into the firelight on its snapped red string, and it hung there against the dark, glowing green as the winter river. And something about it, a small carved fish, a woman's whole dead family in a stone the size of a thumb, held out over a fallen man by a girl with a paring knife who plainly meant to die there, reached into even that mob, and touched the thing in men that a lifetime of hard country buries but never quite kills. Rufe hesitated, and in the hesitation, old Ah Fook and the boy and the other Chinese came back out of the willow brake they had been shoved toward, and they came with picks and river stones and the terrible patience of men who had run their whole lives and had finished running, and behind them, Mayu never learned all their names, but she never forgot that they came. 3 or 4 of the camp's own men peeled away from Terrance's line and stepped across the mud to stand at Ezra Coyle's side, because there is a limit in some men, and a burning and a beating in the same night had found it. Cyrus Tarrant did not die that night. Mayu was almost sorry, later, that he did not, and then was not sorry, because his end was fitter than any she could have wished him.
The marshal did come up the mountain. Ezra had been right about that, right about the one thing Tarrant cared to know. And there were 40 witnesses to a burning and a beating on a lawfully recorded claim, and it turned out that the law, which had bent so easily to keep the Chinese off the gold, could be made to stand up straight when the man beaten near to death upon the ground was a white claim holder with his name on the paper and a marshal writing it all down. Tarrant lost the claims he had overreached to grab. He lost the store to the debts he had run up buying men's loyalty. Within a year, he had left the mountains he had tried to rule, ridden out one gray morning past the far bar where the Chinese lanterns hung red in the sycamore. And Mayu had watched him go from the door of the cabin and had felt nothing at all, which she decided was its own kind of victory. Ezra Coyle lived, though it was a near thing, and it was Mayu who brought him back, as she had brought back the boy. The bitter tea, the curled red root, the cool cloths through the long, fevered nights, while his shoulder knit and the swelling went down off his skull. He woke on the third day and found her asleep sitting up beside the pallet, with his hand held in both of hers, and he did not wake her. She learned that later from old Ah Fook, who had seen it, that Ezra Coyle had lain a long time in the gray dawn light, looking at a Chinese woman asleep holding his hand, before he had gently, so as not to disturb her, closed his own hand around hers. When at last he could stand and walk the bank again, he did a thing that scandalized the camp far more than any burning, a thing they talked of for years. He went down to the assay office in front of everyone and had the claim on the far bar recorded anew, and this time there were 2 names on the paper, and one of them was Fong Mayu, and the assayer's pen shook writing it, and Ezra Coyle stood over him and made him write it plain. "The law says a celestial can't hold ground," Ezra said to her that evening, on the bank, with the river going gold in the last of the light. He said it slowly because he had learned by then that she liked to catch each word. He turned his hat in his hands the old way. "So I've been thinking on it. A wife can hold what her husband holds. Law's funny that way. It's got a hole in it big enough to walk a whole life through, if a man's stubborn." He stopped, and for all his gray years, he could not look at her, and looked instead at the river. "I buried the last people I loved under a tree by the Platte, and I told myself I was done digging that kind of grave." His voice went rough. "But I'd sooner risk the grave than go back to the cabin cold, Mayu. That's the size of it. I'm too old for pretty words, and you'd not credit them anyhow." Then he did look at her, straight on, iron beard and weathered face, and all the long loss in his eyes. And he said the plainest thing he had ever said. "Stay, not to work the claim. Stay, because I've gone and given you the whole of what's left of me, and I'd like to be around when you decide what to do with it." She took his hand and turned it over, the split-knuckled, river-scarred hand that had planted itself in the mud between her people and the fire, and she laid the jade fish in his palm and closed his fingers over it. The fish her mother had pressed into her hand on the Guangdong dock, the last of her family, the thing she had held out over him in the lantern light when she thought they would both die. "My mother said the carp swims against the river," she told him in her careful English, "and does not stop, and at the end of the river it becomes a dragon." She looked at the water going gold. I did not believe her. The river only took things from me. My father, my mother, my country. She closed both her hands around his one, around the jade. "Now the river gives," she said. "You are a foolish, stubborn old man, Ezra Coyle, and you cannot set a riffle bar to save your life, and I will stay." And when he laughed, the deep, unpracticed laugh of a man who had not expected to laugh again, she felt it in her own chest as though the sound belonged to her, and understood that in some way, she could not have explained to the girl on the ship, it now did. They were married in the spring, when the far bar was loud with snowmelt and the blue clay shelf was giving its coarse gold to 2 names on one paper. There was no church and no priest either of them would have owned, so they were married twice over to be safe, once by the circuit preacher who came through with the thaw, and once by old Ah Fook, who read the ancestors and burned the incense and tied a red cord about their 2 wrists and told Ezra, in the English he had been saving up for the occasion,
that he was now responsible for the girl's happiness to the 7th generation, which Ezra received with the grave nod of a man accepting a proper debt. Mei Yu wore her mother's jade at her throat on its mended cord, and an embroidered red shawl she had carried folded and unworn across an ocean and 2 winters and a burning, saving it, she realized now, for exactly this, for a day she had not let herself believe would come. The years came on the way the river came, steady and full of turnings. The far bar paid well and then, as all placer ground does, paid less, and they were ready for it, because Mei Yu had never once believed a river would go on giving forever. They opened a store where Terence had stood, she at the scales weighing gold dust and dry goods, and the bundled herbs that miners of every color came down out of the mountains to buy when the fevers took their camps. For word had gone round that the coil woman could cure what the camp doctors could not. And Ezra at the counter, gone grayer, telling long, slow stories to men who had once ridden a ridge to burn her out and now took off their hats to her, which was a thing she never grew tired of watching.
A red lantern hung at the store's door, lit every evening, and travelers coming down the wagon road in the dark learned to steer by it, and did not always know why the sight of it eased them, only that it did. There were children, a boy with his father's iron patience and his mother's quick hands, a girl who wore the jade fish now on feast days and asked over and over for the story of the lanterns and the fire. And there was, once a year on the turning of the winter, a pot of long-life noodles and a scrap of incense burned to a grandfather in the ocean and a grandmother in the ground, and to all the family that had made the crossing, so that this one small warm room in the American mountains could exist at all. On an evening late in their long life together, Ezra Coyle sat on the porch of the store with his wife under his arm, and the mountains going purple, and the red lantern just lit above the door, and he took the little jade fish between his old fingers, where it lay warm against her throat, and he turned it in the last of the light the way he had once turned his hat, and he said, "Worked out. That's what they told me about that bar." He shook his head slowly. Never was a man so wrong about what a piece of ground had left in it. And Mei Yu, who had crossed an ocean with nothing and been driven up a mountain with less, who had held a paring knife over a dying man and a whole family in a green stone, leaned her gray head against the shoulder that had once stood between her and the fire, and watched the lantern light pool red on the boards where her children had learned to walk, and thought that her mother had been right about the carp after all, and about the river, and about what waits for the ones who do not stop swimming.
So I'll leave you there, on that porch, with the lantern warm and the mountains going dark. And I want to ask you something, friend, before you go. If you had been standing on that bar the night the torches came over the rise, one voice in a crowd of 40, would you have found it in yourself to step across the mud and stand beside a stranger from the other side of the world? I'd truly love to know what you think she saw in him, and he in her. So tell me down in the comments, and if this story warmed you the way that Red Lantern warmed the road, do stay with me, subscribe, and come sit by the fire again, because there are so many more of these frontier hearts still waiting to be found.